So thank you very much to Dr. Lisa Bryce and Dura Jun on the piano, that wonderful performance of Brahms' song, Eternal Love, von ewige Liebe. And Lisa Bryce may have more to say about that. Welcome to the symposium, the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2024. And as always, I'll just state up front that participation in the symposium with me does not constitute endorsement of this campaign or any political campaign. All of us here are expressing views which are our own, but I started these symposia about 2 years ago in order to bring certain topics to the public, which may not normally be discussed, which urgently need to be discussed. And the discussion tonight is with a group of wonderful musicians and music educators whose work is needed now urgently more than ever. And as I said in the invitation to this, one area where you see this is the question of how violent our society has become. And what seems to be really the most horrific is that those who are supposed to be protecting members of society who are weaker than they are or who need protection are in fact abusing their power, whether it is parents out of desperate circumstances or others who are doing irreparable harm or even killing their children, law enforcement officers who are brutalizing or killing the people they are supposed to protect, and our own government, which in our Constitution is supposed to be committed to upholding the general welfare. But I think most Americans feel very much at the time that that is not what our government is doing. And you see it in so many ways, not even outright deaths caused by neglect or lack of funding or certain infrastructure. But if you think about the impact of allowing our healthcare system to decay to the point that it is, or allowing our educational system and even the structures that the teaching is supposed to be occurring in are in a horrific state of disrepair, or the situation we had about a year ago in the Bronx, where a building caught fire because the owner did not want to bother to fix the furnace, so people were using space heaters, and 17 people died of smoke inhalation trying to get out because one apartment caught fire. So you might say, well, you're talking about music education, how is this supposed to address that? Maybe we should just enforce the law. Maybe what we need is more punishment. Well, I don't think so. I think that's part of the problem. We don't solve these problems with revenge or retribution. Now, I wanted to start by sharing an excerpt from a delightful little paper from Lyndon LaRouche way back in 1987, and the title is Agape in Musical Education. And he writes, "The development of the mind of the adolescent student to be inclined to think in this way, and that in all aspects of knowledge and experience, is the purpose of secondary education." And he's just talked about the question of creative mentation, creative discovery, on condition that the correlation of creative thinking with agape, love, is made conscious and efficiently so. That is the development of the student's potentialities of personal character. What is afforded the student is not a detailed map of all knowledge, but rather the means for constructing a map in any aspect of knowledge and experience. To accomplish this, the student must be led through the methods of synthetic geometry, learning to measure experience in a synthetic, geometrical, rather than an ignorant man's counting way. Above all, the student must learn that which is not his native language, that he may be able to compare the two languages and thus acquire the power to think about his own language. He must learn history rather than current events, that he or she might understand the cultural characteristics of behavior are changeables, never given. The student must learn philology and learn the equivalence of the literary and synthetical geometrical statement on the condition that the literary statement is a literate one. The student must learn to think in terms of transitive verbal action, including reflexive and self-reflexive forms of verbal action, rather than the ignorant man's pointing noun, dictionary-like definition way. The student must learn enough of the matter of physical science that he or she might locate experience of the universe in a larger framework of investigation. Above all, in tracing this course, the student must replicate the experience of discovery represented by some of the crucial discoveries of the past. By assimilating the discoveries in this way, the student experiences that discovery as his or her own mental activity. So rigorous creative mental life is made familiar. The object is not to produce a specialist for a particular vocation, but to produce an adult personality whose broadest potentialities of intellect and character are brought to the highest degree possible. After that, specialist learning is permitted to begin. And then he writes, all of this applies to the composition, performance, and enjoyment of music. And I have to read this one more sentence. Broadly speaking, a musician can be no better as a musician than as a human being. So real food for thought there. And I'm going to stop and turn it over to Reverend Dr. Lisa Bryce, who is a performing artist, as you heard, a wonderful soprano. She is a professor with the National Chorales Education Department. She is a vocal instructor and soloist in the New York metropolitan area, and she is a former board member of the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus. So, Lisa, please take it away.
Hello, thank you. I am so happy to be here. I believe that arts education is a necessary vehicle for change. Like Diane said, I'm Lisa Bryce. I have a doctorate degree in music education. I have a bachelor's degree in classical voice and a master's degree in music and opera performance. And I believe that a person rooted in arts education in their background, an adult who has arts education in their background, is a different adult. Um, they have different opinions, different views, and different ideas, which is necessary in today's changing world. Um, when it comes to the emphasis of classical music in today's childhood education of the students, I believe this is key in the formation also of their other subjects. Many people liken Mozart and Beethoven onto mathematics, and they also even compare it to science as well. I believe classical music, music in general, um, in the education does enhance the performance, the student performance in the other subjects as well. In classical music, I believe it is known and is studied to access another part of the brain, a different part of the brain, which is works hand in hand with the other subjects as well. I also wanted to say that the focus and the study that and the preparation it takes to learn an instrument, to perform in an orchestra, a classical orchestra, and the skills that it takes to hone an instrument and to play a classical piece and to learn a classical piece. These type of skills are skills that will only move a student forward. Also, learning a classical song, a role in an opera, or learning a classical song. A majority of classical music originated in Europe and in other lands, and a majority of classical music is in another language. So when a student learns a song, they're most likely learning in another language, a language outside of the native tongue, or also outside of their second language tongue. And this coupling it with learning and perfecting vocal technique is just a skill that is lauded and a skill that can propel a student forward in many ways. the dedication it takes to hone these skills is used for, I believe, when you use this dedication to hone skills for music that is rare, meaning that music that you don't hear on a daily basis, um, it requires the aptitude for a student to believe in themselves, have more confidence in themselves, in what they are doing, and more confidence in what they can do. Once again, there have been studies to show that classical music accesses another part of the brain. And, people that as you mature as a student, many parts of the brain are accessed, but when you access them early on, um, learning, perfecting a talent, and um, likening onto a virtuoso skill is just something parents also strive to have for their child, and that is teachers love and the students also love and can grow also. And I also do believe that um, classical music produces goal-oriented students. Um, of course, to study any course or any subject, you set a goal and you go toward it. But when you have an instrument that is rare or outside of what you may even listen to on a daily basis, you have a more goal-oriented student, and I believe they also know how to prioritize better when it comes to studying also, and they generate an easier will to strive for excellence. Of course, excellence is what everyone wants. Um, there are many methods to thinking of that. You sit and wait, excellence will come. You walk to excellence, one day it will happen. Or, but the striving and the going for it, it's like onto athletics. The willpower it takes to lose pounds, the willpower it takes to win a race. It's all there in classical music learning and singing a different way, this type of way, virtuosic way, and learning an instrument that is centuries old and singing a way that is centuries old. And people liken it unto the angelic singing, and people only listen to this type of singing on maybe special occasions, or maybe a special time or a special night out. Many do understand this. So I believe when it comes to the arts education and incorporating classical music, this is important, monumental, and necessary. And it's something to strive for, to include across the board. So I understand how many students agree. The students agree, the parents agree. When it comes to funding, it's something to fight for, something to be there, something that is necessary. And once again, I would close with this, um, just the positive points. Classical music produces goal-oriented students who know how to prioritize, and they also generate the easily generate the will to strive for excellence.
Thank you, Lisa, and we'll have more time for discussion at the end. So I want to go to Dana Annex, who is a violist and music teacher joining us from Chicago. And you may talk about whatever you want, but we were talking about some of the challenges that come up also teaching young people classical music. So please go ahead and don't forget to unmute.
All right, thank you. I teach two kinds of, excuse me, two kinds of after-school music class. A violin class for students at the beginning level from ages in kindergarten through third grade, and a chamber orchestra class for fourth through sixth grade students. So that's violin, viola, cello all together, kind of like a chamber music lab kind of situation. And I think that these instrumental music classes should be designed to prepare students for creative musical activities spanning their entire lives. I actually learned to play violin initially in one of these kinds of classes. So I see kind of what things made it click for me and what didn't, and how I can kind of now I'm the teacher, how I can make it more useful for the students, thinking of them as lifelong creative people. Like, and as an adult, should they be able to improvise? Should they be able to compose? Should they just be able to play super well? Should they be able to just sight read anything? We have to think about what kinds of skills matter for an adult. So in general, I find that the content of these classes is just too narrow to achieve that purpose. And though I view culture and all the cultural problems that we face now as being downstream of economic and political conditions, I still think that we should strive to improve all that is in our power to improve, because I think it's these kind of humanities studies among the general public that give people something to live for, something to fight for, to improve the standard of living more broadly, I think. So I do see the musical education curriculum as a factor within our control. For example, a beginning level instrumental music curriculum typically focuses on basic instrumental technique, basic note reading. And though these are essential skills, I think a beginning class can go far beyond these basic skills, because someone who's just learning to play or sing cannot play or sing for very long at a time. There's a lot of time you could spend working on historical knowledge or theory knowledge, and just creative activity. And since I started this year, I'm a fairly new teacher, but I'm always so I am always experimenting. I started implementing a more well-rounded curriculum, which has been really inspired by like the conversations I've had with people in the Schiller Institute. I've seen immense improvement, especially in my beginning level students. So we start the course with the concept of meter, because they're in a group and they need to be able to really be like rhythmically entrained and play together. So we start with poetry that's written in meter. So we read poetry by Shakespeare and Langston Hughes and analyze the meter, and then listen to music in gavotte and minuet dance forms. So they start to understand music's not just what comes through your headphones. There's a long history with connections to poetry and drama and dance. So that's important to think about when you're performing. Students are learning solfege earlier from day one, and using that skill to compose basic phrases, little melodies against a bass line that just moves like tonic, dominant tonic. And now they are always requesting to compose and play their own music, and have it recorded, listen back to it again and again, and they love hearing their creations. So just to conclude, I think that these kinds of things, like historical significance of music and basics of counterpoint and improvisational skills, are the really important foundations for lifelong creative musical activities, which I think can be encouraged from the very beginning of a student's musical training. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very exciting report. So now I will go to our guest, Professor Edward Harrison Gordon, who is the president and founder of the Nubian Conservatory in Brooklyn, who also was the choir director with the New York City Department of Education for 31 years. And I understand is also a veteran, which I'm raising because I think that's important given the amount of war on the planet today and insights from that. So thank you for joining us. Yes.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I've got a lot of things here. I'm going to try to stay within my 10 minutes. The first thing I want to put out there is that there is a New York State regulation from the Department of Education, New York State Department of Education, which states that all high school students, I repeat, all high school students must receive one term of art or one term of music to receive a diploma in New York State. And I mention that because so many of our schools, especially in the Black and Brown communities, are allowed not to have music and art. And this is such, causes such deprivation for our students. But I also hasten to add, having grown up in New York City and come to the New York City school system, I remember when there were no policemen in the schools, no security guards, no metal detectors, and our schools were beautiful. But one of the reasons was our schools were exciting places: art, music, drama clubs, dance clubs, in addition to math, English, science, and history. I have to move on because there are other speakers. The next thing in my notes I want to mention very quickly, this idea of renovating office buildings. My voice is acting a little silly tonight, I apologize, but renovating office buildings into schools, which do not have gymnasiums or proper chorus rooms, orchestra rooms, or even auditoriums. This is a travesty against our kids, which must stop. We need to build proper schools, or at the very least, renovate older school buildings so that these kids can have proper facilities to learn everything that they need to learn. If you look at some of the great minds in history, Albert Einstein played the violin. George Bush Sr. played the electric guitar. We know Bill Clinton plays the saxophone. Barack Obama sings tenor. Michelle Obama studied piano. Condoleezza Rice is a concert pianist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that many of the great minds in history were also amateur musicians. Music does wonderful things at the brain. Dr. Bryce talked a little bit about the effects of music on the brain. Math, English, science, and history, and I'm facing you, are controlled by the left side of the brain. Speech is also controlled by the left side of the brain. Musical creativity is controlled, and artistic creativity is controlled by the right side. When you sing, your brain is using speech from the left side and musical creativity from the right side. Music is the only subject among the higher forms of learning that uses both sides of the brain simultaneously. None of the other subjects do that. I've got to move on. There is also the Mozart effect. They have found that students listening to music of Mozart scored higher on math exams. If we look at music therapy, King David in the Bible, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, we're looking at history here, but David was also a musician. He played the harp.
Professor Gordon, there we go.
Oh, we're there?
You froze for a second. You froze for a second. You just brought up King David.
David also played the harp, and whenever Saul was troubled in spirit, David would come in and play the harp to soothe him. Some historians feel that Saul may have had epilepsy. I'm going to move on. I think we need to move away from this concept of STEM, which leaves out the arts. We need to move more into a concept of STEAM, S-T-E-A-M, which includes the arts. When we do STEM, we're really running a sham on these kids. They need to have all the subjects. Chopping up a building and calling it a campus is another travesty. Anyone who's ever been to college will tell you that just about every college on the face of the earth has more than one building And if they don't, they're making plans to buy another building. But to the point, you have different buildings for different areas of expertise, and you have to run back and forth across the campus to get to these different buildings. To take one building and chop it up and call it a campus is a travesty. Johnny cannot take orchestra on the fifth floor because he's registered for a school on the fourth floor. This is a joke, and it's not good for these kids. Our kids are running wild because there is nothing to soothe the savage breast. There's the famous expression, which is often misquoted. Music soothes the savage breast. I've got to move on. There was something else. All right, I've run out of notes. I know there was some other things I wanted to bring up, but in closing, I believe, and I will guarantee, as a graduate of the New York City school system, if we bring the arts back into our schools, we will eliminate 99.9 of the violence. The kids need something to express their creativity, something to touch their souls, something to soothe them. And I'm talking about classical music, which has already been mentioned, which does have a calming effect. Yes, people have a right to listen to other things and all of that. But if we look at the statistics and we look at the schools which are still teaching classical music, practically no violence at all, as opposed to schools that are using other things. We can no longer take someone who writes poetry, and sometimes filthy poetry, with the N word or the female dog word, and call them a musician. At best, they are a poet. Maybe not a good one, but they're a poet. But they're not a musician. If you're not singing or playing an instrument, you are pulling a sham on your audience. Let us stop playing games. 10 people were trampled to death at a so-called concert a few months ago. I'll leave names out of it to include a 10-year-old child. Let's stop playing games with these kids. Tell them the truth. Encourage them. Open their minds to something that will uplift them. I could go on all night, so I'm going to be quiet at this point. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much. So I'll have Jennifer Pearl, who is the president of the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, and who is the chair of the voice department at South Shore Conservatory in Massachusetts, share her thoughts. And then I certainly have a lot of thoughts from what I've heard here, and we'll open it up and you'll get a chance to remember everything you forgot to say when you were speaking. So Jen, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I'm really glad you ended with that, Dr. Gordon, because I think this really gets at the root of the question, which is the culture and what we're battling as music teachers, music educators on a daily basis, is the effect of 50 years of a violent, really degenerate culture, deliberately degenerate, affecting not only the children that we're teaching now, but their parents' generation. And I'm seeing this daily when I'm teaching voice. I also work with some programs in some inner city schools, to get this sense of beauty with young people. Beauty and creativity is so key in inoculating young people from what they're dealing with on a daily basis. And that's something that I wanted to talk about just a little bit, because I think that that classical music and classical composition was written, I mean, this is sort of a general statement, but I'll just say the intention by the composer was to draw out the best in the human being who's participating in it, whether it's the listener, whether it's the person performing it. And, the poetry, like you take the case of these art songs, I like to do these sort of art songs and folk songs with my younger voice students. And there's a reason for that. The poetry is beautiful. It talks about the beauty of nature. It talks about the kinds of things children should be thinking about, not the kinds of things that they're surrounded by. in the social media, 75% of social media today is pornographic in some form, right? This is the constant what they're surrounded by, and so these kind of beautiful songs, these beautiful melodies, I think are extremely important to develop the souls of our young people. And I've kind of made a fight on this with a number of my students and their parents, but and you know, there's small victories in that, but I really think the fight is the general culture. I just wanted to bring up one quote which I think is just kind of captures it, from Alma Deutscher, who's this child prodigy composer who's now 16, but she started composing when she was 3, and she has fought to maintain this sense of beauty in her compositions, even under the immense pressure. And I'll read this quote here that she said a few years ago. She said, "It has been often suggested to me that as a modern composer, I need to integrate more harshness, experimental dissonance into my compositions to reflect the modern world. But there is enough ugliness in the world as it is, and I'll never understand why I should add more ugliness to it with ugly music."
Wow.
Yeah. I think that really captures it. And it's, you know, that's just an example, but I think this fight for beauty is even bigger than we might even imagine, because everything about the culture, the you know, the wars, the violence, it kind of reinforces this sense that human beings are just animals and we're just, you know, fighting amongst each other, and that's our nature. So anyway, those were just a couple thoughts that I had, and I can maybe just, yeah, anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jen. So I think Jose will bring us all up and we can talk. I was thinking about well, there are many thoughts that I have about this, but one question in working on a classical composition, a beautiful composition, is that you begin to get an idea in your mind of perfection. That is, you have a sense of what the composer intended. It's your sense of what the composer intended. But then you're honing both your skill and your interpretation to be able to deliver what the composer intended. And you definitely have a sense of right and wrong. That is, you try something and it just is kind of ugly, or it doesn't add to it, or it just quote unquote feels wrong. And there's the obvious things like playing or singing a wrong note or being out of tune, technical things, which are also important, because one thing I've noticed with many younger people today is actually they lack muscle coordination. They're not, and I think what you're saying, Professor Gordon, about not having a gymnasium, they don't have physical education, they don't have music, they have nothing where they're actually training their body to be able to reflect what's in their mind. And it's terrible. And I think somehow this affects the way you think. It hadn't occurred to me when I read Plato's Republic and he talked about the importance of what they translated as gymnastics, whatever it is, some kind of, I didn't take it that seriously, or I thought, okay, well, that was then, but do we really need it now? And I think we do. I mean, Dana brought up dance. That's one form of it. Very important. But this idea of perfectibility, which is also unique to human beings, right? You don't see a squirrel, you know, throw its acorn down again. I'll say, gee, I really didn't get that the right way. I think I'm going to throw this acorn again and see if I can do it better. This is unique to human beings. And when we begin to attain this conception in our mind, it's also a very profound sense of happiness, which is also our young people are so deprived of today. So anyone who has any thoughts on that or anything else, please just chime in. And if we get too raucous, we can go to raising hands.
it's really essential to keep the peace and the importance of music and the importance of music education. I understand what you are saying, and to incorporate all of this in our thinking and to incorporate all of this in our mind is a necessity for well-roundedness. To have everything going and to keep the peace, first of all, to keep the peace within oneself, and then when we um, correlate with others, to keep it going, just to as Ms. Pearl, to string the pearls and to keep them going. And I believe it is essential, and this type of being that you discussed is what is needed.
I was also thinking, Dana, when you were speaking about, I've been reading Helen Keller's autobiography and Anne Sullivan's letters about teaching Helen Keller, and then the letters of their teacher about working with the two of them. There's a couple of things. One is Macy, Mr. Macy, I think is his name, the professor, a teacher. He describes Helen Keller's personality, and he said he never met a purer person in his life. And perhaps that was also the effect, well, definitely was in part the effect of Anne Sullivan, who simply chose not to translate. That is because all their communication was through spelling through on her hand. And then eventually Helen was able to do lip reading by putting her finger on your lips. But in other words, she's deaf and blind. So there's so much that she's not hearing. But Anne Sullivan was very careful to not transmit negative, small-minded emotions, greed, selfishness, to such a degree, something that was near and dear my heart. This is a famous quote from Helen Keller when she had a beloved huge dog named Lion that escaped and ran through the town and was shot to death by the police. And Helen's response was, if they had known what a good dog she was, I'm sure they wouldn't have shot her. No rage, no malice, just presuming the very best about the officers who killed the dog. And taking that through her whole life. And someone could say, oh, well, she's really naive. She doesn't get how the world works. She doesn't realize that. No, it's a completely different outlook. But also what Anne Sullivan's discovery, she said after a few days, because she got the very first day, she spelled the word doll into Helen's hand. And immediately Helen got the association of a word with an object. And it went so fast that Annie said, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to do 6 hours of learning, 3 hours of alphabet. I'm throwing out the textbook. She's going to learn the way that children who have sight and hearing learn. And I don't care if she doesn't have the vocabulary. When we're together in a room and other people are speaking, I'm going to spell into her hand every single word that everyone is saying, whether she understands it or not. And she'll begin to get a few of the words. And then she said, and the whole world, it's all play. So they went on trips in the woods, and Helen felt, a mouse and a cat and a dead animal and a tree. She loved flowers, and she learned them all by their scent. And so that everything they experienced, Helen was encouraged to simply take it all in the way that she was able to. So by the time she was 17 years old, and Anne Sullivan came to her, I think, a few months before Helen's 7th birthday, so she was 6.5 years old. So she had been under instruction for barely 10 years. She was determined that she was going to go to Radcliffe College. And she had to take an exam, which took 5 hours because people had to communicate with her somehow, the words, which involved German, French, English, and mathematics. And she passed all of it. Um, and I was thinking that this should be required reading for every educator, and I feel so sorry that I'm reading it so late in life. And Anne Sullivan was so disturbed. She went to a school for the deaf, and she saw the teacher on the blackboard dutifully writing, "See Spot run. Spot is a dog," just these boring sentences. The kids weren't interested. And she said for their age, there was no comparison. Helen was leap years ahead of them. But she said it wasn't because that Helen was so much smarter, but merely because they had decided they had to stick to this rote, boring method, as opposed to allowing children to learn the way they learn, where they're taking in everything at once. It's all part of their development.
I'd like to go back for a moment. You talked about physical education, coordination, and that is so important for these young people. I think also the physical activity lets them burn off some of that steam. We want young people nowadays to sit in these schools like little robots. That's not the way kids think, breathe, live. And also, coordination is also taught in music. Those of you who are instrumentalists, those of you who those of us who sing. I don't sing as well as Dr. Bryce. I'm a frustrated singer. But the point is, there are still muscles, laryngeal muscles, that move the vocal cords, which obviously have to be coordinated properly. So we're dealing with that. I often tell my students that music is the master subject. They look at me like I'm crazy. Why? Well, you have whole notes, half notes. That's math. Mozart lived after Bach. That's history. You have A440, which is the note that orchestras tune to. That's a principle of physics. You have the longer string instruments, which give the lower sounds, and the longer vocal cords, which give the lower sounds, and the shorter string instruments, which give the higher sounds. These are principles of physics also. So it draws on other subjects in order to succeed. And then, as Dr. Bryce pointed out so beautifully, the use of language. Over the years, I've taught students to sing in French, German, Italian, Latin, Greek. The first part of the Catholic Mass, contrary to the popular consensus, is actually Greek. Kyrie is Greek. After that, the Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus, etc. The rest of that is Latin, and people often are not taught the difference. But the use of the different things that music uses. I had a student very quickly, he was in his English class, and the English teacher was working on SAT words. And the teacher said, well, what does a cappella mean? And the kid raised his hand. He said, singing without instruments. She said, where'd you get that from? He said, well, I sing in Mr. Gordon's chorus on the other side of the building. That's where I learned it. We sing a cappella sometimes. But there again, this child's vocabulary and any child's vocabulary is expanded. You're going to say to kids, okay, this music has to move faster. You've got this Italian word, allegro, etc. So there's so much stuff, and I don't want to hog the show, that we are depriving these kids of when the parents are told, well, they don't need music, they don't need art, they don't need dance, they don't need drama. These are not just artistic skills, but they're life skills. I've played for funerals, weddings, church services, as well as working in the classroom. So I had different ways to supplement my income because of having studied music. I'm going to be quiet a minute so somebody else can.
Sorry. Yeah, I agree totally. The day is super long in public schools and private schools too, obviously. But I think that the public schools are so designed to like create this ideal like worker consumer that they're just like sit down, sit still, get on your computer, do your your math assignment on the computer. You can just guess the answer and it will just tell you what's right in the end. People aren't really working with their hands. And I too, along with Diane, I observed the lack of motor coordination. Many of my students don't have this problem, but when I go and see non-music students in like a different kind of classroom setting, it's like they can barely hold a pencil. It's like they're so used to touch screens now, like they're in their early life, they aren't developing fine motor skills or coordination or anything. So yeah, the whole day is just like being a little like worker bee at a desk and they don't run around, they don't play, they don't work with their hands, and it's really depressing to see.
They don't work with their brains either. And many instances, I'll leave that alone.
I like what you said earlier, the story about Helen Keller. In my ministry studies, I studied the life of Fanny Crosby, the famous writer of the beautiful hymn, Blessed Assurance. She herself was blind and grew up such as Helen Keller. And the story was just phenomenal. I watched it, read it, and she produced some of the best hymns, most lauded, most popular, most beautiful hymns you can imagine could come from someone who's blind, who just had to work twice as hard to be able to understand music, understand music, and to be able to have such compose such beautiful music, especially even at that time, being female, being handicapped with the loss of the sense. It's just wonderful, and it's an inspirational story of what music can do, of music education, and that music can be understood and used by everyone.
Exactly. And I think it also underscores where our identity truly lies. Because if you place your identity in those things in the physical domain, or Bach in his in the Jesu meine Freude motet, which so many of the people associated with LaRouche worked on for many years, the difference between the flesh and the spirit. And when you think about your mortality and your immortality, what actually is enduring? The things that we tend to think are very enduring are the things you can put your hands on, or the things, can you see it? Can you smell it? Can you touch it? But those things that are invisible, like an idea, like a discovery, the discovery of Beethoven, of a beautiful symphony, which he created in his mind, that endures. And if you ask someone, well, where is it? How much does it weigh? Can you smell it? In what domain does this exist? And that's just an incredible thought. And I think also I would like to touch upon a little bit, because as people may know, I am participating in a large anti-war demonstration on February 19th, President's Day weekend, called Rage Against the War Machine. And I regret at the moment there's not going to be singing there, but perhaps there may be, because maybe there'll be enough of us to do some singing, except for the performers, the official performers. But I think there was a reason for singing in the civil rights movement, or many reasons. And I think I'll stop and let others talk about it, because this is something extremely important if we're going to find our courage to overcome some extremely evil policies.
Well, I certainly think as a choir director, singing is just a wonderful outlet. But as an African American, the history of Black American music is intertwined with so much of our daily lives and the lives of the enslaved Africans in this country. You had the work songs used during the day in the field. You had the spirituals, the African American spirituals, which were not only used for religious purposes, but also for signals for the Underground Railroad. The spiritual, so sorry, Steal Away to Jesus was one of Harriet Tubman's better known signals for those enslaved African and African Americans who were preparing to escape on the Underground Railroad. But I hasten to add, certainly music is dominant and defines, it has been said that music helps to define a culture. And I've worked with students from different parts of the world. And in some cases, I've tried to pick up just a little tidbit of their culture through the music. And one of the defining factors of any culture is the music. But I also hasten to add, we need to find the better forms of music, which is what this discussion is all about, you know. And I think, as a Black musician, I've tried very hard to preserve some of the older forms of Black American music. I have performed ragtime. I have performed the spirituals. Dr. Bryce has been a key factor at the Nubian Conservatory. We love her to death, and we don't want to kill her, but we love her to death. And she has been one of our driving force voice teachers, and not just because she's a wonderful musician, but there's a beautiful spirit in her, and the kids gravitate, young people, adults gravitate towards that. There is a song, very quickly, it's around, and the poetry, I think, is apropos to this setting. All things on earth shall fade under the sky. Music alone shall live and never die. It's around a little piece.
Yes, if we were live, we could sing it together, but it doesn't work in this Zoom format.
Yeah, Zoom is rough.
But I think also the singing, especially in a chorus, gives you really a sense of unity. And that there's strength in that. It helps to overcome the fear. And this question about the timing, Dana, I think it was you who was talking about the getting this question of the timing and the pulse, because it's a motion and it's a metric, so used to allow the people to be unified. And you always notice when someone doesn't quite get it right, they're off. And when it kicks in, then they're in, and you're in something which is moving. And of course, if you're marching 30 miles from Selma to Montgomery, this is very helpful to help you keep your feet moving. And inspire yourself.
Yeah, you also feel like you're part of something bigger than just you, and that's, I think, really so important with the chorus. I mean, you see that with children's choruses, and also the rehearsal process, I think, is really important, because you're also developing this, sixth sense among humans of this feeling of getting it right when you're in a chorus. You know when you get it right, and everybody knows, and then there's this shared experience of this incredible, or in an orchestra too. I've experienced it in an orchestra. You just get it right, and you're like, that's this incredible human moment that can be shared, and there's a lot of joy in that. I just wanted to touch on one thing on the question of the physical. We were talking about the kind of the physical challenges, the small motor skills. I work with a class of children with autism, and we do a lot of work with like instruments and things like that. And I've seen an incredible development. I only work with them an hour a week, but incredible development by using like the drums and the sticks, and then singing, and also using scarves to move to music, to classical music and things like that. There's been an incredible development over a few months where when I would go in there, initially they wouldn't barely even notice that I was there, and they would be acting up and screaming and talking the whole time. But over a series of months, now I come in and they even start singing the songs that I'm going to sing with them before I start singing them. And that's just an example, one example, but I think, and also just they get so excited when they have those instruments. I mean, the shakers and all these things, and they're not violins, they're not cellos, but it's a way of expressing actually something. Some of them aren't verbal, and it gives them an opportunity to participate in beauty, even if they can't verbally participate.
Music does so much for the confidence. I have a student, Dr. Bryce, and I both work with a student, and I didn't find out till recently she's classified as special ed because I've always treated her as regular ed, and I taught her 2 songs in Italian, and she's learning basic piano. And whenever she tells me I can't do this, I can't do that, I tell her I'm not going to accept that. You can do what you put your mind to. And I tell her all the time, you've got a beautiful brain inside screaming to get out. Let's use it. And I think so much of the our society discourages kids, puts them down. We're too busy telling these kids what you cannot do, what you should not do, rather than saying, here's a violin, here's a viola, here's a cello, here's a piece of choral music, here's a piece of piano music, here's something you can do that will move you forward. I have found in over 50 years of teaching, a lot of times, all a kid really wants is just a little bit of encouragement. That's all they really want. Somebody to say, you can do this. I believe in you. And kids take off. They take off. I never try to limit a student, even when I think inwardly, well, this kid doesn't have as much talent as Joe Blow. Joe Blow can play the first movement of a Mozart sonata, yada, yada. But when I talk to the student, we're going to work at your level, your pace. And kids surprise you. The kid who you think is going to make leaps and bounds sometimes gets lazy and figures the world must come to me. And then you have the student who says, I've got to work harder because I don't have as much talent as John Brown or whatever. And that's the student who gets the 4-year scholarship, music scholarship to Bryn Mawr College. And you're scratching your head saying, but I thought Sally was going to get that. Mary got it. Sally thought the world would come to her. Mary said, I'm going to work because I know the world won't come to me. So kids are amazing. I'll be here all night.
Well, I'm glad you said that because we should probably wrap up, but I want to give everyone a chance to just say any thoughts you have that you wish you had said, or the reflections before we wrap up. So Dr. Bryce, maybe we'll go to you. What would you like to say in closing?
Arts education is the vehicle for reform and unification. It will bring the world together as a whole, and will also bring your world together. It is the glue for education, for the curriculum, and it is very important, and it is a must. It's a necessity. I am glad it is a requirement in the education system.
Thanks. Now we have to make it stick. Professor Gordon, what closing thoughts do you have?
The most important thought that stands out in my mind, we've got to go after the politicians, the educators, and tell them these kids need the arts. And as I said at the top of this discussion, the New York State Board of Regents requires that a student have 1 term of art or 1 term of music to graduate. And they let these people slide by that requirement. And it's got to stop because our schools are running amok. And that's my final thought.
Okay, I'm with you. Good. Dana.
I think all of us kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think that people in general, and especially children, are capable of so much more than they're kind of expected to do. So I think we should always be giving people greater and greater challenges, positive kinds of challenges, not, day-to-day trauma challenges, but creative, intellectual challenges every day.
Yes, I agree. Jen?
Yeah, I agree. Well, I guess I would just say that these young children and young people that we're working with, and this beauty that we have a lot to change. We have a lot that's threatening that right now in the world, and it kind of renews your commitment to, stop this drive for war, solve the economic crisis for these young people so that they can have a future. But beautiful music is certainly a reason to do that, so that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank all of you for participating. Again, participation in the symposium does not constitute endorsement of any political campaign. I will say, as a candidate, as I've said before, one of my campaign pledges is that if I am elected into the US Senate, I will be organizing a chorus of 100 senators, because they have to learn how to relate to each other and produce something beautiful instead of all of this noise and squabbling for ugliness. And maybe some of them can liberate themselves from their own corruption and the lobbyists and the military-industrial complex that is making them behave so horribly. So I think this is very urgent, and I know we're so far gone from a day where classical music was part of everyone's life that many people I speak with believe that classical music is the domain of wealthy white Americans over the age of 80. That is not the case. This is, Beethoven once said, if people understood my music, there would be no war. Mozart got in terrible trouble for speaking about someone being a nobleman as an accident of birth. The great musicians were fighters for mankind. And we talked about Handel's Messiah a couple weeks ago and what he was doing, working with Jonathan Swift and other co-thinkers of the liberation of America from the British Empire. So that's what we're talking about. And there was, just so you know, here, you'll see it. And when you go to YouTube comments, a little debate going, isn't this too esoteric? What does this have to do with anything? That's the point. People believing that this is esoteric shows how far removed we are from how human beings should be. And I think if you consider that every child should have a minimum proficiency on an instrument, be able to sing as if it's a language, be able to write poetry, that should be normal, then you realize how much we've been robbed. So I'd like to, again, thank everybody. I think we'll be having more such discussions, and I hope that we're able to do something in person sometime with musical performance and lots of young people. So with that, we'll conclude. I would like to say that I'll be participating tomorrow in a very, very important conference of the Schiller Institute, which begins at 10 o'clock in the morning. And it's in two panels, 10 to 1, 2 to 5, called The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. Wow. And we are really at a turning point. And I would encourage everyone to tune in tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the schillerinstitute.com. So thank you very much.